I am Vinay Gupta of the Hexiart project, and mostly what I work on is open source housing. This is a thing called a Hexiart. It's a super simple building. The wall pieces are made of a whole sheet of industrial panel, so 1.2 by 2.4 meters. It's the standard size for plywood, for sandwich panels, for insulation boards. This picture was taken at Burning Man, you know, this big festival they do in the desert every year in America. They built about 1,000 of them this year. Roof pieces are half of one of the wall pieces, so you could basically make these structures just by doing straight cuts across more or less any kind of industrial panel material. For the large domes, it's also made up of these half pieces. So what you've got is a simple kind of kit housing that you can put together out of more or less anything, straight from the factory into housing with minimal sort of industrial processing in the middle. You don't really need a factory to make them. This is a plywood model that we did in Haiti a few years ago. It was built by a bunch of people who'd never built one before. They just took the designs from the internet and put it together as a test unit. And it was very successful. An aid worker lived in it for several years. What I'm going to talk about today is how we reimagine the future by looking at the bare necessities of life. And this is not a sort of radical step. Most of the people in the world are still in the process of solving the basic problems of how they stay alive. They're trying to figure out how not to be too hot, too cold, hungry, thirsty, ill, or get injured. And we solved these problems in our own societies really only within the last century. American life expectancy in 1900 was 45. Right? 1900, American life expectancy, 45. Current life expectancy in the Congo is, I believe, 56. So the rate of progress in terms of life expectancy, in terms of progress of keeping people alive, is absolutely unbelievable. And we've done it by very radically changing the way that we provide basic life support. So if you think about the old world, the farms and the villages that our ancestors all came from, in that world, your water came from a well, and if your well got contaminated, you got sick, and that was pretty much the end of the story. Where we are now today, your water comes from enormous reservoirs, and then it's processed in factories and tested for quality, and then it comes out your taps. But all of that system is still solving the same problem that you're solving with a well. So what happened is, as we came into the cities and as we went through this industrial revolution, what we started to do was build larger scale infrastructure for keeping us alive. It went from being a well for the village to being a reservoir for the city. And what came out of that was that we could use experts who were quite expensive, but we divided the cost of the expert who would test the water among all the people that would drink it. So as part of the movement to industrial production and industrial scale, we also got industrial infrastructure, and that's kind of the way that our world works. So what I'm going to talk about is how the kind of miniaturization that produced things like cell phones could also apply to the infrastructure in a way that creates a completely different potential political future. And it's unlike anything that people have really envisaged clearly. It's not sexy and fictional. It's not the kind of thing that immediately grabs the attention. But I think that more than half of the human race are going to live this way in future. So let me start with the question. Who would not like to be able to afford a nice house in the country? Right? Some little place in Norfolk or Sussex, a few acres of land, an old farmhouse that's been nicely retrofitted, maybe a few solar panels on the roof. You know, you grow some of your own vegetables in the garden out the front, and you work on the internet and write your documents and video conference into the office. Does that not sound roughly like the aspirational lifestyle that a lot of us want? Right? Certainly it sounds pretty good to me. Right? If you try and do that in Britain, it's going to cost you something on the order of £300,000 to £500,000 to buy the place, get it set up, and get yourself installed. And then you're going to need to generate £20,000 to £50,000 a year to maintain your lifestyle on top of that. Right? It's very expensive to pull yourself out of this kind of centralized Western industrial capitalism and put yourself back on the land in a slightly upgraded living condition that your ancestors would recognize. You're basically going back to what the original builders of that farmhouse had, but the difference is that now you have an internet connection, clean water, and it cost you £500,000 to get there. Right? And it's this paradox that actually the golden apple at the end of the capitalist trip, the brass ring that your 30 or 40 years of successful work buys you, is a lifestyle like that the original builders of the farmhouse you buy had, only you've got clean water and you work on a computer rather than backbreaking physical labor. Right? It's actually a very, very strange paradox that for most people, the urban phase of their existence is seen as being an on-ramp that will take them back into the rural phase, but there's no direct path to get there, and most of us don't actually make it back out of the city again. The city is where you come to make the money to buy yourself back out into the country at a higher level of living. And this is a deep paradox. The reason it's so difficult in the cities is that the cities are enormously economically productive, but they're also enormously economically competitive. There is a catastrophic competition, which is why a flat in central London costs you something like £3 million. And the break with the idea that the aspiration is to move to the city and stay there happened sometime over the last 30, 40, 50 years. We began to realize that actually, psychologically, the cities were not great places to live. They weren't working for us very well. They were great places to work, but nobody actually wanted to raise their kids there if they had enough money to make a choice. The cities are workplaces. So right now, half of the human population grows most of its own food on farms. They've got essentially the same lifestyle niche that most of Britain had in, say, 1600, and that's South America, India, parts of China, most of Africa. The population, about half of them, are on the land. Usually the land is owned or it's informally managed and it's always been there. And the standard of living is very low. The water is dirty, the stoves that they're cooking on emit a lot of smoke, so everybody's smoking the equivalent of 20 a day just from cooking fires. There are all kinds of terrible diseases which lower life expectancy, and somewhere between 1 in 5 to 1 in 20 of the children will die before the age of 5 of disease or other rough problems like this. It's really not a great position to be in. And a lot of the reason that these folks are trapped in these lives and can't get out is because of the enormous hyperconsumption that fueled European and American economic growth all the way through the colonialist period. Right? These folks are poor because our ancestors basically nicked everything that wasn't nailed down. But in the 21st century, I think that what is going to happen is that the villagers of Africa, India, and South America are going to leap past us. They're going to leapfrog over the city, and they're going to leapfrog over what you think of as being Western industrialized society. And it's actually not very hard to imagine. You start with your individual building, whether it's a mud hut or a thatched hut, and you put some kind of water-resistant coating on the outside that came in a gallon jug, and it lasts much longer than it used to. Stuff's pretty cheap. It's about $15 or $20 a gallon, not bad. Then you put some solar panels on the roof, and that's maybe another $30 to $50 for enough energy to charge your cell phone. And in a few years, it'll be, what, $30 or $50 to buy a decent little tablet computer with maybe a keyboard. And the water filters that they use for camping are now down to about, 30 quid if you buy a cheap one. And there are some really good designs from an English outfit called Safe Water Trust, which are even cheaper and they'll last more or less forever in a typical village context. And you have a little bit of a solar light and you get some internet access because your panel is connected by 3G or 4G or 5G to the local mast. And now your kids are getting an education off your tablet computer, and you've got solar panels on the roof that keeps it running, and you're beginning to do a bit of translation work for your cousin who lives in New York, and you're still growing your vegetables out the back, but now you can look up crop diseases, and there's this thing called permaculture that you're taking an online course in. And pretty soon what you realize is that the rural farmers of the developing world, instead of all migrating to the cities, making a bunch of money, and then buying themselves a farmhouse in Norfolk, have stayed where they were and added very low-cost, very local versions of all the critical amenities they need. And they're now self-sufficient on their own land, and they've got a standard of living which is roughly equivalent to the rural farmer in Norfolk. It's just they didn't have to buy a Land Rover, they're still going around on a bicycle. And this notion of rural life centered around the bicycle, the solar panel, and the tablet computer, versus rural life based around the Land Rover, the diesel generator, and the combine harvester, it's really just a matter of technological leapfrogging. The industrial model of what agriculture is like came out of diesel, and it came out of combine harvesters, and it came out of the enormous need to centralize agricultural production for economic efficiency. But actually, the global economy doesn't really have any more seats. The reason that we've got so many poor people in rich countries is because the global economy is no longer generating enough wealth to provide a middle-class standard of living for everybody in the formerly rich countries. It just doesn't work. As you get more rich people in China and more rich people in India and more rich people in Africa, the increased resource competition simply drives up the prices, and as a result, we are beginning to fall into poverty as they are beginning to generate a middle class. But there's no way of arranging the pieces where we wind up with a 9 billion person world where everybody has 2 cars and a 4-bedroom house. It's just not possible. There isn't enough metal, never mind enough money. The estimate that I've seen is that there are less than 5 kilograms of copper for every human being on Earth, and most of that is actually sitting underground in European and American countries. So what I want to propose is this. Right now, there's been this kind of model that the rest of the world was going to follow us up this arc, and at the end of that arc, they would have some version of the lifestyle that we have in Europe and America. And actually, I think the actual truth is that we took an early branch on industrialization and wound up jammed in a dead end where we are dependent on fossil fuel to maintain our economies, and we're destroying the world by burning it. So we don't have a way of getting back from fossil fuel and our enormous levels of environmental consumption to a sustainable lifestyle, right? We can't really figure out how to go forward to make that jump. If we go to nanotechnology and biotechnology, we're simply going to generate an incredible new class of problems, the likes of which we've never seen, and those problems will be even harder to control than the stuff we have now. We're in a cul-de-sac, we're at a dead end. But the rest of the world that hasn't industrialized can learn from all the technologies we've developed and all the mistakes we've made, pull what is best out of our culture, and they can go straight forward on the straight path. They're already living at roughly 1 planet's worth of consumption. India's average environmental footprint is about 0.7 of a planet. Right? 3/4 of a planet is your average Indian. That gives them 1/4 of a planet to pay for their tablet and their solar panels and a few other bits and pieces like their water filter and their cook stove. And at the end of it, what you're left with is self-sufficient peasant agriculture, education by internet, and a standard of living that is roughly what we aspire to when we get rich and retire, without having to go through the urban hyper-capitalist phase first. So I think the future is going to look like a farmhouse in Norfolk for just about everybody, but they're not going to come to the city and get rich first. Thank you.